Part of my goal with Uplift Ultra and the Remarkable Moments series is undoing and looking past the distortions that has been perpetuated, and to see the full story of Canada and its many different peoples. Today we're going to talk about maplewashing. What is maplewashing? The term comes from whitewashing and is specifically directed towards Canada. It refers to a perceived tendency by the media to perpetuate an image that Canada has a superior grasp in dealing with the social issues as compared to other countries. The term implies a sanitization and concealment of undesirable qualities of the country and its history. And it's not just the media. Everyday Canadians often say, better than the US, and while that is true in some regards, it does ignore the serious issues of systemic racism and destructive effects of capitalism that plague Canada as much as it does the States. Maplewashing is something we do in response to international outrage towards inequality and human rights issues in the States and other countries. We play up the Canadian stereotype. We share Trudeau doing a yoga pose. We point to our celebration of equality, our beautiful outdoors, our military history, our social history. The Meanwhile in Canada memes are the best example of this. They present Canada as a wholesome, happy-go-lucky frozen country that is safe and equal. Beer and hockey, maple syrup and moose, rush and rugged outdoors, a subtle but overt superiority over the United States. The quirky neighbor to the north, that outdoorsy people that survive the crazy winters and have gorgeous mountains and rugged forests and beautiful views. The people with undying loyalty and support for Canadian industries, as evidenced by the whole Heinz fiasco. It's a part of a wishful Canadian identity that we feel separates and differentiates us from the Americans. All this does is give off the smug implication that prejudice and racial violence are foreign concepts in Canada, when in reality we are much more similar to the US in that regard. 2 days after George Floyd was murdered by the police in Minnesota, Toronto police threw a black and Indigenous woman off a balcony to her death, and the police ended up getting away with that scot-free, and the media hardly ever covered that incident. The recent discovery of the mass graves of 1,170 Native children at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, as well as additional residential schools in Brandon, Manitoba, and Regina and Leithstock, Saskatchewan, has confronted what many people have believed as Canadian history and identity. It is a stark reminder of the genocidal policies directed against the Indigenous population since the beginning of this country and to this very day. There is no possible way I could cover the entire history of Canada and its mistreatment of Indigenous populations in one video and give proper justice to the victims and their descendants. Despite the promises of supposedly progressive Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, there has been very little in the way of improvements to First Nation communities in Canada under his reign. The 2020 Coastal Link gas line pipeline protest occurred under his watch after a pipeline was and is being constructed through Wet'suwet'en territory in BC. The protests were met with violence from the RCMP, and police threatened journalists from recording the brutality and military-grade weapons used against these protesters. The Micmac lobster fishing dispute that is still ongoing between the Indigenous fishers and non-Indigenous fishers over Indigenous fishing rights granted in the Halifax Treaties. There's been violence against Indigenous fishers, including burning traps, as well as the assault of Sipiganati chief Michael Sack during a protest. Trudeau has also spent $100 million fighting reconciliation measures in Canadian courts, including residential school survivors seeking restitution. He has done nothing on his promise to get First Nation reserves clean drinking water. His government is years behind on its pledges, and there are 52 active long-term drinking advisories in effect in 33 First Nation communities as we speak. It seems as if Justin Trudeau is using his father's playbook for Indigenous issues and continuing their mistreatment. Under Pierre Trudeau, the residential school system was directly under control of the Canadian government. He steadfastly refused Indigenous autonomy and self-government. He also refused to apologize for Canada's past mistreatment of the Indigenous people, saying, quote, "We can mount pressure groups across this country on many areas where there have been historic wrong," end quote. Pierre Trudeau also proposed the much-criticized 1969 White Paper, which would have abolished all former treaties and Indigenous status in Canada in an attempt to assimilate the Indigenous into the Canadian population. Many believe that the proposal, rather than acknowledging historical wrongdoings and fault, the Canadian government was trying to absolve itself with fault. And let's not absolve the Conservative Canada either, what with accepting party donations from known neo-Nazis, members being caught taking pictures with far-right extremists numerous times, and shelling out $5 million for a fucking stupid Victims of Communism memorial to be built. Oh, after denying the Truth and Reconciliation Committee $1.5 million to find mass graves at residential schools in 2009. Oh, and cutting vaccine education in 2009, while at the same time pumping money into anti-drug advertising, which has directly affected Canada's response to the ongoing global health crisis. Targeted attacks against Muslims are not a foreign concept in Canada either. In 2017, a far-right nationalist army cadet killed 6 people and wounded 5 in a Quebec mosque. He was motivated by Canada's allowing refugees into the country in response to Trump's travel ban. He was sentenced to life in prison, but not charged with terrorism due to Canada's terrorism laws and how they are worded. Even while writing this video, a Muslim family was killed by a 20-year-old white Canadian man simply due to the fact that they were Muslim. I could do a full video on Islamophobia in Canada alone, and I will do so in the future. The fact that all of this has happened in Canada flies in the face of the perceived tolerance and progressive nature of the Canadian people and our identity. Maplewashing is a form of nationalism that is exclusively Canadian, designed to insulate us and the world from the horrors of reality in Canada. This is something that has been taught to us. We are told Canada is a cultural mosaic and not a melting pot of its citizens. We are peacekeepers, not a warring nation. And this is not just through presentation of media, but in our history courses. It was both only in the last decade that the residential schooling system and the brutality of the system was actually taught to Canadian students in Canadian history classes. My generation were some of the first to ever learn about this stuff in Canadian history courses. Maplewashing is merely a projection of what we wish we could be as Canadians and what we want the rest of the world to think of Canada. But in doing so, we are willfully remaining ignorant to the darkness of Canadian history and current events, all the while putting on a facade of a progressive utopian country for international validation over our American neighbors. We can do better, and it's time we do better. So this was the first episode, hopefully in a series of more where I'm just going to be covering different parts of history, like I said, remarkable moments, as well as other parts of Canadian history as well that people are maybe not aware of, including Canadian citizens. So I hope you like it. Like and subscribe, and keep your eyes locked for more.